September 20th, 1970. 2 a.m. Newburyport, Massachusetts. A quiet coastal town, 35 miles north of Boston. The National Guard Armory sits dark and silent, filled with military weapons, ammunition, and equipment. Outside, 5 figures approach through the darkness. They're not soldiers. They're not thieves looking to profit. They're college students and ex-convicts united by a single purpose: to strike back against what they see as an oppressive government waging an illegal war in Vietnam. For the next several hours, they will execute a calculated raid on a United States military facility. They will steal weapons and ammunition. They will set fires and trigger explosions that cause over $125,000 in damage, and they will do it all without firing a single shot. A guerrilla operation carried out with the precision of trained commandos. But this raid is just the beginning. 3 days later, these same activists will rob a Boston bank to fund their revolution. A police officer will be shot dead. And what follows will be the largest manhunt in New England history. Nearly 3,000 law enforcement personnel searching for 5 radicals who believed they could change America through armed resistance. This is the story of the Newburyport Armory burglary, a forgotten chapter of American radicalism, a crime that proved how easily dedicated activists could strike at the heart of military infrastructure, and a tragedy that shows what happens when idealism turns to violence. To understand the Newburyport Armory raid, you need to understand the world of 1970. America is tearing itself apart. The Vietnam War has been raging for years with no end in sight. President Nixon has just expanded the conflict into Cambodia. On May 4th, 1970, National Guard troops opened fire on student protesters at Kent State University, killing 4 students and wounding 9 others. For young Americans opposed to the war, Kent State was a turning point. Words and peaceful protests weren't working. The system wasn't listening. Some believed it was time for direct action, armed resistance, revolution. Enter the group that would raid the Newburyport Armory. Catherine Ann Power, 21 years old, a student at Brandeis University. Bright, passionate, deeply committed to the anti-war movement. She came from a comfortable middle-class family in Colorado, but became radicalized by the violence she saw on television every night. Vietnamese villages burning, American soldiers dying, protesters being beaten by police. Susan Edith Sachs, also 21. Power's roommate at Brandeis. Another student from a privileged background who had become consumed by radical politics. The 2 young women had attended protests, sit-ins, and demonstrations. But it wasn't enough anymore. Stanley Ray Bond, 26, a convicted felon who had served time in Walpole State Prison for armed robbery. But Bond was no ordinary criminal. He was a former Army helicopter pilot who had served in Vietnam. He'd seen the war up close and returned home disillusioned and angry. While in prison, Bond enrolled in a university program for inmates at Brandeis, where he met Power and Sachs. Robert Valeri, also an ex-convict who Bond had met in prison, another man with nothing to lose and everything to fight against. William Lefty Gilday, 41, the oldest member of the group, a career criminal from Amesbury, Massachusetts, with a rap sheet dating back to 1947. Armed robbery, concealed weapons, assault. He'd spent years in and out of prison, But now he'd found a cause: the anti-war movement. Together, these five had formed a cell connected to the Weather Underground, a militant offshoot of Students for a Democratic Society that believed in overthrowing the U.S. government through armed revolution. Their philosophy was simple: the American government was waging an illegal war. That government was the enemy. And to fight that enemy, they needed weapons. So they began planning a raid on the Newburyport National Guard Armory. Unlike typical criminals who rob for profit, this group was planning a military operation. Their goal wasn't money, it was weaponry. Rifles, ammunition, equipment that could arm a resistance movement. For weeks during the summer of 1970, the group conducted reconnaissance on the Newburyport Armory. They observed security patterns, or rather, the lack thereof. National Guard armories in 1970 were surprisingly vulnerable. They weren't designed to withstand determined intruders. Most had basic fences, minimal alarms, and no guards on overnight duty. The Newburyport facility was no exception. The group studied the building's layout. They identified entry points. They planned their approach routes and escape routes. Stanley Bond, with his military background, understood tactics and logistics. He knew what equipment to target and how to move efficiently through a secured facility. But they also knew that simply stealing weapons wouldn't be enough to make their statement. They wanted to damage the armory, cripple its operations, send a message that the military-industrial complex wasn't invincible. They acquired the tools they'd need: wire cutters, crowbars, containers for carrying ammunition, accelerants for starting fires, and they planned for violence, bringing weapons in case they encountered resistance. Their target date: September 20th, 1970, a Sunday night when the facility would be completely empty. The group also had a backup plan. If the armory raid was successful, they would use the stolen weapons to fund their revolution through bank robberies. Armed with military-grade firearms, they believed they could expropriate money from capitalist institutions and redistribute it to the revolutionary cause. What they didn't fully consider was how quickly this would spiral into violence and tragedy. Sunday night, September 20th, 1970, 2 a.m. A vehicle pulls up near the Newburyport National Guard Armory. 5 figures emerge, dressed in dark clothing, carrying bags of equipment. The streets are empty. The armory is dark. This is it. They approach the perimeter fence. Wire cutters slice through chain link with quiet efficiency. One by one, the group slips through the opening and moves toward the building. The armory has a basic security system, an alarm connected to the local police station. But the group is prepared. They've brought tools to disable it. Whether through cutting wires, jamming signals, or simply working faster than police could respond, they neutralize the threat. Now they're inside the armory grounds. Using crowbars and other tools, they force entry into the main building. The locks give way. Doors are pried open, and suddenly, they're standing inside a United States military weapons facility. Rows of rifles, crates of ammunition, military trucks, communications equipment, everything a small Revolutionary Army could need. They work methodically, systematically. Bond directs the operation with military precision. This weapon, that ammunition, load it here, move to the next objective. They steal 400 rounds of ammunition, high-powered rifles, a military truck, equipment that could arm dozens of people. But they're not done. To send their message, to demonstrate that the government wasn't invincible, they begin setting fires. Accelerants are poured. Matches are struck. Flames begin to spread through the armory. They also set off explosions, using materials found on site or brought with them to create maximum damage. The blasts echo through the quiet New England night. By the time they drive away in the stolen military truck, loaded with weapons and ammunition, the Newburyport National Guard Armory is burning. Smoke billows into the night sky. Fires rage through storage areas and administrative offices. The damage will eventually be assessed at $125,000, a massive sum in 1970, equivalent to nearly $1 million today. But there's a problem. 5 radicals with military weapons, burning buildings, and revolutionary rhetoric have just committed a federal crime: assault on a military installation. The FBI will be called, state police, local authorities. The hunt will begin. Worse, the group has left behind evidence. Despite their planning, they've made mistakes. And in their rush to get the stolen truck back to their safe house, they've exposed themselves. Within days, the FBI will know who they are. September 23, 1970. 3 days after the armory raid, Brighton, Massachusetts. The 5 members of the Revolutionary Cell enter the State Street Bank and Trust Company. They're armed with the weapons stolen from Newburyport, including a Thompson .45 caliber submachine gun, the infamous Tommy gun. Their plan: rob the bank, expropriate money for the revolution, and use the stolen weapons to intimidate anyone who tried to stop them. The robbery itself goes according to plan. They announce the holdup. They control the bank employees and customers. They grab cash, $26,585. Not a huge haul, but enough to fund their activities. But then everything goes wrong. A silent alarm has been triggered. Boston patrolman Walter Schroeder, 42 years old, a 9-year veteran of the police force, husband and father of 9 children, responds to the call. As the robbers flee the bank, Schroeder arrives at the scene. There's a confrontation. Shots are fired. Schroeder is hit by rounds from the Thompson submachine gun. He falls. The robbers escape in their getaway vehicle, but they've just crossed a line they can never uncross. Patrolman Walter Schroeder dies from his wounds. What started as an anti-war protest has become murder. Within hours, the FBI and Boston police have warrants for all 5 members of the group: Catherine Power, Susan Sachs, Stanley Bond, Robert Valeri, and William Lefty Gilday. The charges: bank robbery and murder of a police officer. What follows is the largest manhunt in New England history. Nearly 3,000 law enforcement personnel, police officers, state troopers, FBI agents, game wardens, even military personnel, begin searching for 5 radicals who are now armed and extremely dangerous. The manhunt was massive and intense. Robert Valeri was captured quickly. He agreed to cooperate with authorities, testifying against his accomplices in exchange for a reduced sentence of 10 to 15 years for manslaughter and robbery. 4 days after the robbery, on September 27th, Stanley Bond was arrested in Grand Junction, Colorado, trying to board an airplane. But Bond would never stand trial. While awaiting prosecution at Walpole State Prison, he built a homemade bomb. planning to use it in an escape attempt. On October 6, 1970, the bomb detonated prematurely, killing Bond instantly. Some investigators suspected the bomb had been booby-trapped by authorities who knew about his escape plan. Bond's body was cremated and buried in Los Angeles National Cemetery. William Lefty Gilday proved harder to catch. For days, he evaded thousands of searchers, leading police on chases through Massachusetts. On September 29th, 6 days after the bank robbery, police finally cornered Gilday in Worcester following a high-speed chase. Gilday was arrested, tried, and convicted of murdering patrolman Schroeder. He was initially sentenced to death, but when Massachusetts abolished the death penalty, his sentence was commuted to life in prison without parole. Gilday maintained until late in his life that he didn't pull the trigger, that another member of the group, Michael Fleischer, was the actual shooter. Fleischer turned state's evidence and testified against Gilday, receiving immunity for his cooperation. Whether Gilday was telling the truth or shifting blame remains contested, but 2 members of the group remained at large, Catherine Power and Susan Sachs. In October 1970, both women were placed on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list, the 5th and 6th women ever to receive that distinction. And then they vanished. For years, the FBI searched for them. Tips came in from across the country. Reported sightings, possible leads. But Power and Sachs had gone deep underground, assuming new identities and building new lives. Susan Sachs was captured in Philadelphia in 1975, 5 years after the robbery. She was tried, convicted, and sentenced to 12 to 14 years in prison. She served 7 years before being released. Catherine Power remained free even longer. For 23 years, she lived under an assumed name, got married, raised a son, and worked as a chef and restaurant owner in Oregon. But the guilt consumed her. She suffered from severe depression, haunted by the death of patrolman Schroeder and the life she'd destroyed. On September 15th, 1993, Power turned herself in to authorities in Boston. She pleaded guilty to manslaughter and armed robbery and was sentenced to 8 to 12 years in prison. She served 6 years before being released in 1999. The Newburyport Armory raid and the subsequent bank robbery left deep scars. Patrolman Walter Schroeder's family never recovered from his death. His widow, Claire Schroeder, spoke at Catherine Power's sentencing in 1993, describing the decades of pain and loss her family endured. 9 children grew up without a father. A wife became a widow. All because 5 radicals believed the ends justified the means. The Boston Police Department named its headquarters after Patrolman Schroeder, the Schroeder Plaza, a permanent reminder of the cost of political violence. As for the stolen weapons and ammunition from the Newburyport Armory, most were recovered by authorities shortly after the arrests. The military truck was found. The ammunition was seized. The armory was repaired and continued operating. But the psychological impact of the raid lingered. It exposed how vulnerable National Guard facilities were to determined attackers. Security at armories across the country was significantly upgraded. Fences were reinforced. Alarm systems were enhanced. Guards were posted. The raid proved that military installations on American soil could be successfully attacked by small groups of dedicated individuals, a lesson that changed security protocols permanently. William Lefty Gilday spent the rest of his life in prison. He became a jailhouse lawyer, helping other inmates with their cases and fighting for prison reform. He died in 2011 at age 82, having spent over 40 years behind bars. In his final interview with the Boston Globe, he expressed remorse for the death of Patrolman Schroeder, saying, "I wish we never would have gone to the bank that day." Catherine Power, after serving her sentence, moved to Oregon, where she lives a quiet life, occasionally speaking about her past and the consequences of political violence. The Newburyport Armory burglary represents a dark chapter in American history, a moment when idealism turned to violence, when anti-war activists became armed revolutionaries, and when a righteous cause was forever stained by the death of an innocent man doing his job. The raid itself was tactically successful. 5 people with basic tools and determination broke into a military facility, stole weapons and ammunition, and caused massive damage without firing a shot. It was, in military terms, a textbook guerrilla operation. But what came after? The bank robbery, the murder, the decades of imprisonment and grief proved that there are no shortcuts to social change. That violence, even in service of supposedly noble goals, creates more suffering than it alleviates. Today, the Newburyport Armory still stands, though under tighter security than it had in 1970. The weapons stolen that September night are long gone, recovered, destroyed, or lost to history. But the memory remains, a reminder that in a moment of national crisis, when America seemed to be falling apart, some people chose violence over patience, armed resistance over peaceful protest. And a police officer named Walter Schroeder paid for that choice with his life. Thanks for watching. If you found this story compelling, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. And let me know in the comments, how should we remember political violence from this era? As misguided idealism, as terrorism, or as something more complicated? See you next time.